All right, everyone. I want to start with a little bit, just for a moment, the section that we looked at last time, which is the end of chapter 27. We'll be looking in the Eitz Chaim, beginning with verse 15 on page 928. 928, verse 15, which is really this is God speaking to Moses, responding really to Moses's request that God appoint a replacement for him, because God has just reminded him that he will not make it into the promised land. And so Moses is concerned about the continuity of leadership. And he speaks to God. We're again, verse 15, chapter 27. Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, "Let the Lord, source of the breath of all flesh, appoint someone over the community who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall take them out and bring them in, so that the Lord's community may not be like sheep that has no shepherd." So Moses comparing the role of the leader to a shepherd, as I mentioned last time, it is perhaps an apt metaphor for him, because the people of Israel in general are, in some sense, leading them is like leading sheep. And Moses has a lot of experience initially as a shepherd in his young life. There's a lovely midrash which says that Moses was out watching sheep for his father-in-law Jethro, and one of the lambs went astray, and Moses went to great pains to get it and bring it back to the flock. The midrash says God saw that and said, "Yes, this is the person who is appropriate to lead my flock." At any rate, and he says, the one who will take them out and bring them in. And this is, at least some authorities read this as referring particularly to war. That Moses is, there are going to be these wars of conquest as the people go into the land that God promised them. And Moses is the one who, sorry about that, hold on. Moses is the one who will bring them out and take them in. And God responds, and he says, "Single out Joshua, the son of Nun, an inspired man. He's Ish Asher Ruach Bo, a man with real spirit. Lay your hand on him, have him stand before Eleazar the priest and before the community, and commission him in their sight. Invest him with some of your authority." So Joshua is not going to have the stature of Moses. Moses is unique. He's a prophet. Joshua is not going to be a prophet. Although I think, by the way, I could be wrong about this, but I sort of remember that he is in the Islamic tradition viewed as a prophet. That's something worth checking into. I'm not positive at all. But anyway, in the Torah itself, he's certainly not a prophet. He's a leader, a political leader, if you will, not necessarily a spiritual leader. Moses is, in addition to being the political leader of the people, he is the one who communes with God. That role, the spiritual role, is now going to be divided between the high priest, in this case, Eleazar, and Joshua, who will be the leader. There was always a high priest, but he didn't see, and Aaron was that priest, but still Moses continued to be the intercessor with God, the spiritual figure. So Joshua is a lesser leader. He's invested with some of Moses's authority so that the community will obey. In other words, he has to have some stature for the people to rely on him and to see him as a leader. he shall present himself to Eleazar the priest, who shall on his behalf seek the decision of the Urim before the Lord. So he doesn't ask God for direction himself. He goes to the high priest, and the high priest attempts to ascertain God's will, but not directly either. God doesn't speak to him. He uses the Urim, right? And elsewhere, this is referred to as the Urim and Tumim, right? Words which are really unclear as to what they mean. Some think that they mean light and truth. That's one explanation. Some things thinks it has to do with things that are positive and negative. It's not clear. Now, whatever the Urim and Tumim are, they are associated with the priest's breastplate, and somehow they give some answers. It seems in general to be yes and no answers. That the function, they're very binary. It's a little bit like computer code, on or off, right? And so the Urim or Tumim would be asked, you could divide the people in half, and you would say this half or that half. And then you divide them ahead again and again. And that method is used in the book of Joshua to determine someone who has violated the cherem and put the whole people in charge by taking some of the prescribed materials for himself. There are other authorities, modern scholars, who think that the Urim and Tumim, and those who think that it was binary, think that it might have been something like dice that had been in the breastplate of the priest, and he could take them out and throw them, and somehow that would indicate it. Others think that they were something that lit up. Urim means light, right? And there are even theories that they represent the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and they might light up in sequence and actually spell out words. So no one really knows. It's all scholarly speculation. But the point here is Joshua doesn't get revelations, not directly. Anyway, Joshua is through the priest, who doesn't get them directly either. God's will be made known. And this is part of a process which we see really, as we look at the Torah as a whole, of God continuing to step back. God speaks to Moses directly. Here, there's a step back. And we saw that in Genesis also, right? God spoke to Abraham directly. Then God begins to appear in dreams, continues to be less and less direct. Okay, but God's will be made known to Joshua, and Moses does what God commanded him to do. He takes Joshua, he has him stand before him, and he lays his hands on him and commissions him as God had spoken. Okay. So where we are now is Moses' successor has been appointed. Also, we've learned about how the land will be divided, that it will be divided among the tribes by a lottery, and that those allotments, and to individuals, and those allotments will, the inheritance of those allotments will go from generation to generation. And as we saw in the story of the daughters of Zelophehad last time, if there are no men to inherit the allotment, then women will also. We're going to see towards the end of the book of Numbers some limitation on that. But now, since we've divided up the land, we now have to think about what's going to happen in the land. And we're going to get how the people of the land will be staying connected to God, right? And primarily that's through sacrifice. And so what we get now is the list of sacrifices. This section in Pinchas is read on Shabbat. A portion of it is read on Shabbat and on the holidays. And we know that as the Haftorah, not the Haftorah, but the Maftir reading in some cases, or in other cases, it actually, well, in both cases, it becomes part of the Musaf Amidah, right? So we not only have on Shabbat a regular Amidah, but we have an additional Amidah called Musaf, in the Musaf service. You may wonder, why do we repeat? Why do we have the Amidah in the morning service and we come back? Well, that's because of the Musaf sacrifice, the additional sacrifice for Shabbat. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Okay, so God says to Moses, command the people to be punctilious in presenting to me at stated times the offerings, right? At stated times, meaning they can't be done at whatever time you want to do them, right? People can always make free will offerings, but in terms of these communal, national offerings done on the behalf of the whole people, there is a specific calendar. And these are offerings of food to me, korbani lachmi leishi, right? So food is an odd word, and the Hebrew here is lechem, right? Bread. Lechem and being synonymous with food. Even today, we say that a meal where you eat bread is a real meal. With a meal where you eat bread is where you say the Birkat HaMazon afterwards, the grace after meals. If there's no bread, you don't say the grace after meals, or you don't have it, right? So we have that said. Now, what does it mean to give God bread? Does God eat? And the answer is no. But the pagans did believe that they were feeding their gods. And every morning they would give their gods breakfast. Right? The gods got at least 2 meals a day, and they were dependent on those who worshiped them to feed them. So the language here really expresses, it's an idiom, it's kind of a dead idiom, right? But it is grounded in something which was real in the pagan world, right? So what we do get, reach nichoach, which is a pleasing odor, right? There is, and smell the odor of the sacrifices. No, but there is this sense that it's pleasing to God, right? That human beings, in their obedience to God in making these offerings, God experiences something pleasurable in that. So now we get, say to them, these are the gifts you are to present. And now we're going to get a list of them, and they are going to be in order from the most frequent to the less frequent, right? First, we're going to have every day. Then we are going to have Shabbat. Then we're going to have Rosh Chodesh, and then we're going to have the holidays, right? So the preference, the main thing, the thing that comes first is the most frequent. And this principle that what comes first is what's most frequent is what comes first, actually is the basis for a certain legal view in Judaism. Let's say that you have a number of different blessings to recite. What order do you recite them in? And since Pesach is coming, I'll give you an example from there. We eat matzah, and we're going to say a blessing over matzah, right? And there, when we eat matzah, we're also eating bread. Right? So we're going to say 2 blessings. The first blessing is the blessing over bread, right? Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And you'll see this at your Seder table. Before we eat matzah, first we'll say the motzi, and then matzah. Well, blessed are you who has commanded us to eat matzah. Why not matzah first and then motzi second? Why is it motzi matzah, right? Because motzi is more frequent. Because we eat bread all the time, we're only commanded to eat matzah on Pesach. So just as the more frequent comes first here, the more frequent comes first when we have an obligation to say blessings. I'm going to stop just briefly here so that if there are questions up to this point, we'll take them before we actually dive in. Just give me a minute to change the view. Okay, Sandy, go ahead.
Okay, so I have two questions. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. Well, comments. The first one is the Urim smacks me of superstition, and to have somebody's life or whatever in the balance based on something like tossing dice or something seems wrong. How is this viewed?
Well, I mean, look, the Bible does not view this as superstition, right? The Bible views this as a way of determining God's will. Now, it disappears, right? We don't have anything like this in rabbinic literature, right? But the assumption of just as God makes pronouncements, right? God initially speaks and says this or that. Now God is communicating in a different way, right? So I don't think in terms of the Bible, it's superstition. And as we move later on, they don't exist anymore. But taking the Bible in its own terms, it's not superstition.
I mean, it sounds like magic. Doesn't it sound like magic?
Well, it is a kind of, but it's not magic in that you're changing things, right? A magician is someone who through magic, it's more divination, right? It's the ability to divine something. But here too, the Bible views it as legitimate. It's not that the Bible is opposed to thinks divination doesn't work, right? It's simply not legitimate in general, but in this case it is, right?
Right.
And we also saw this with the woman who is accused of adultery by her husband, and she goes through this trial by ordeal, right? We saw this at the beginning of the book, and somehow through this, they're able to determine whether she's innocent or guilty. I suggested then that actually the trial is such that she's not going to be found guilty because it doesn't actually happen. And the rabbis certainly think it doesn't happen and it disappears. But part of the biblical view is just as God does make God's will known through dreams, right? And we see that certainly in the Joseph story. You had another question also.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that answer. The second one is the part where it says the pleasing odor, the sacrifice. Right. So I guess you're not supposed to take that literally, but I find that repulsive because a dead animal, that's a pleasing odor. And why does God need animals to be killed to be happy?
Well, I mean, I think you're also.
It sounds terrible. It sounds, kill these animals. Kill these animals.
Okay, so remember that sacrifice was how people ate meat in antiquity, right? In other words, God would get a certain part of the animal, and actually, usually the part that wasn't, people didn't eat. The blood would be sprinkled. The fat of the animal was particularly, but in almost all cases, the sacrifice is consumed, usually by the priests, sometimes in the case of a Thanksgiving offering or the Passover offering, for example, this is how people ate, and this is how they consume meat. So it's not merely that God says, oh, burn this up because I like the smell, right? It is, in some ways, a sacrificial meal is a shared meal with God. Now, you could argue, well, but they should all be vegetarians, right?
Right.
We don't have to kill animals at all. And there is a sense in the Torah that is viewed as, in some sense, more ideal, right? You look at Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they're not, seem to be allowed to eat meat. God says, from all the trees of the garden you can eat, right? But not that tree. Right? Nowhere does God say that you can eat meat. It's not till after the flood. And there it seems to be a kind of divine concession. And even there, God says, well, you can eat meat, but not the blood, right? don't be bloodthirsty in some sense, right? So I don't think this is simply about, we got to kill animals because God likes the smell. Okay, does anyone else have a question or comment? If not, we're going to dig into some delicious sacrifices. Okay, I'm going to change the view. All right, so I want to start then with the daily offering, right? What's known as the Olat Tamid, the everyday, right? 2 yearling lambs without blemish. You should offer 1 lamb in the morning, 1 at twilight, right? So, and it says, and as a grain offering, which is grain offering is mincha. That's how it's described, right? As a grain offering, you should offer 1/10 of an ephah of flour. And so what we have here are 2 or perhaps 3 offerings, and they're done every day. And this then is the basis, becomes the basis, and the timing of these offerings becomes the basis for the idea that Jews should pray every day 3 times a day. Specifically, say the Amidah, which is the central prayer of the service. That is to say that the Amidah, we no longer offer sacrifices. So what we do in place of the sacrifice is to say words, right? And we're going to do it at the same time and as we would have offered sacrifices. Prayer. Now, prayer has another function as well. And I thought it would be interesting to look at some rabbinic material around that. And so I'm going to share my screen for a second. Okay. And what we have here, it comes from the Talmud in Brachot. And I'm going to start here. It was stated that Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina, said, the practice of praying 3 times a day is ancient, albeit not in its present form. Prayers were instituted by the patriarchs. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, prayers were instituted based on the daily offerings in the temple. Prayers parallel the offerings. So we have a dispute between 2 rabbis as to the origin of prayer. And now we're going to look at sort of where that comes from. Okay, so the case of the second one, right, is pretty clear, right? But how do we know that Abraham was the first person to pray in the morning, and that Isaac was the first person to do mincha, and Jacob was the first person to do the evening service? We don't see that, at least not explicitly in the Torah. And so what we get is, how do we know that Abraham instituted Shacharit, the morning prayer? As it said, when Abraham came to look over Sodom the day after, he had prayed on its behalf, and Abraham arose early in the morning to the place where he had stood, right? God has destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, along perhaps with Lot, Abraham's nephew. Abraham looks out and he says he comes to the place where he stood, and then standing actually can refer to prayer. We call the prayer Amidah, which means standing, and we have a verse, and we know this verse, we just looked at it. Pinchas stood up and prayed that the plague ends. So this teaches us with these verses that Abraham instituted the morning prayer. And then we get Isaac institutes the mincha. Isaac went out to converse in the field, lasuach b'sadeh. And what is conversing? Nothing other than prayer. And we get a verse from Psalms, a prayer of the afflicted who is faint and pours out his complaint, sicho, his complaint from the same root before the Lord. Isaac was the first person to pray mincha. And finally, we have Jacob. He davened Mariv the evening. Why? because we have a verse, he yifgeh b'makom, and slept there. This is Jacob who's going to go down and see the ladder between heaven and earth. The word encounter means nothing other than prayer, and we have proof here where God says to Jeremiah, don't encounter me, don't pray to me, in other words, and Jacob prayed the evening prayer. So we have these three passages where the rabbis are going to read in that Abraham instituted the morning prayer, Isaac instituted the afternoon prayer, and Jacob instituted the evening prayer. I want to say something, though it doesn't have to do with sacrifice. I want to say something about that midrash because it suddenly occurred to me what's really going on here. And it was so stunning that I really need to share it with you. So look at the passage about Abraham, right? Abraham is standing there looking at the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah, the smoke still coming up, and he prays, according to the rabbis. What is he praying for? I would suggest probably Lot, his nephew, who was down there, right? So he's praying out of a situation really where he's emotionally overwrought. He's asking in some ways for God's help. What about Isaac? Well, Isaac, according to this, went out into the field to pray. This is immediately after the death of his mother, right? Isaac is mourning Sarah. And in fact, his prayer, as it were, was answered because along comes Rebecca and he marries her. He takes her into his mother's tent and he's comforted for the loss of his mother. So he too is in this emotional place of distress. And that's where the prayer comes in. Jacob, where is he? He's just run away from Esau. He's in the middle of the wilderness, right? He has nothing, puts his head down on the stone, and God appears to him, right? So in some ways, I think that the rabbis are not really talking about, well, who started these prayers? In some ways, they're talking about what is prayer, right? And prayer is an individual plea from a person in distress. Now, let's look at the other view, which was the view of Yehoshua ben Levi, which it's based on the daily offerings. Why did the rabbi say the morning prayer may be recited till noon? Because although the morning offering was typically brought in the morning, it could have been sacrificed till noon. And then we get Rabbi Yehuda, who says, I think that the morning prayer has to be recited until 4 hours in the day, right, rather than 6 hours, because the daily morning offering is sacrificed in 4 hours, and then the afternoon, the mincha prayer, also from when the sacrifice could be, and then the evening prayer, because the things are still offered on the altar. So according to this view, what is prayer really about? It's about acknowledging God, right? Bringing our tribute to the king, as it were. We take something, some animal belonging to us, and we offer it to God. So these are two different views about where prayer comes from. According to the view that it was instituted by the patriarchs, prayer is about, we pray to God because we need God in our moment of distress, right? It's about us. Help me. But according to the view that it has to do with the sacrifices, that's where it comes from. Then this is really about God, not about me. This is something I give to God, right? Now, this will go on to harmonize the two views and to say, well, both are true. It was instituted by the patriarchs, but it also comes at the time of prayer. At any rate, I'm going to stop my share now, coming back here, and I'm also going to ask for a moment, any questions about this midrash before we go into it, which I find really profound, right? You start with this idea, well, where did prayer come from? No, I'm sorry, who instituted prayer? But we're really looking at a midrash which is talking about what prayer is really about. What's it for, as much as where it comes from. Saul, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of questions. One is, if you look at the Luach in the Orthodox synagogues, there is a set limit for the Kriyat Shema in the morning,
Right,
especially in the winter. It's about 9:30 in the morning.
yes.
So here they're talking 4 hours. I'm not sure what
Okay, but that's something else, right? We have two things. We happen to combine them in our service, but there are two things and they each have their own time frame. Shema, remember that Shema says when you lie down and when you rise up, right? So the timing of the Shema is at night and in the morning. So the rabbis, this is the first thing we find in the Talmud, right? When do you say Shema in the evening? When do you say Shema in the morning, right? That's separate from the Amidah, which is this prayer which replaces the sacrifice, and it has its own time frame. By the way, one of the things that's before Congress now is whether they're going to make daylight savings time permanent. And that, because of the timing of Shema, it will, if they do, is going to cause problems for people who really worry about this. Because if the sun doesn't come up until 8 o'clock in the morning, you can't say Shema until 8 o'clock in the morning. It's actually not sun up. It's Netzach Hama, which is sort of the brightening of the horizon. Rabbis actually say it's when you can tell the difference between blue and white on your tzitzit, when they had blue tzitzit, right? So it's actually, and there's been a move, particularly among the Orthodox establishment, to petition Congress not to make this change because it will really be problematic. And I mean, they make other arguments in terms of school children in the dark and so on. We'll see if it actually happens. Okay, any other questions on the Midrash? Okay, great. So we're going to go back to now the text, change the view. Yeah. Okay, so we first of all find out about the daily offerings. And now we move on to Shabbat. Now, this may be familiar to you because this language is picked up in the Musaf Amidah, right? An additional, so the other thing is these sacrifices are cumulative. So we have a daily offering. Shabbat, there's also going to be an offering, but Shabbat is a day, right? It's every day. So on Shabbat, we're going to have two offerings. We're going to have the daily offering, and now we're also going to have a Shabbat sacrifice, right? And that's why we have Musaf, right? Because on Shabbat, there were two sacrifices. So we have two services, the morning service and also Musaf. And this text is literally now becomes part of Musaf. And you probably even know a melody for it from the repetition of V'yom Shabbat Shnei Kvasim B'nei Shana Tmimim, right? Uvayom, Uvayom, Uvayom HaShabbat. Or maybe you know a different melody to it, right? But so it's taken here, and it goes on. A burnt offering for every Shabbat, and it's Olah Shabbat b'Shabbato. The Shabbat offering on its Shabbat. Literally, from this, the rabbis derive that if you don't do it one Shabbat, there's no makeup, right? It has to be on that Shabbat. So it's not like they could offer, we didn't have a bull. We have to wait till next week, but next week we'll offer 2 bulls, right? Can't do that. It's interesting with respect to the Amidah that there is a sense that you can do that. If you don't say the Shacharit Amidah, you're allowed to say it twice at Mincha to make up for it, right? Which is kind of striking. But here with the offerings, and it's sort of, that's a place where this idea kind of breaks down that there's a correspondence between the Amidah and sacrifice. Now we move on to something which is a little less frequent, and that is Rosh Chodesh, right? Shabbat comes 52 times a year, but there are only 12 months in the year, or perhaps 13, if it's a leap year where we have the extra month of Adar. So that's the next thing on the list. And again, it's cumulative. So on Rosh Chodesh, we're going to have the daily offering and the Rosh Chodesh offering. And if Rosh Chodesh happens to fall on Shabbat, we have three, right? Because it's the daily offering, it's the Shabbat offering, and it's also the Rosh Chodesh. This coming Shabbat is one of those Shabbatot. Right? We have three. And beyond that, it's also Shabbat HaChodesh. It's one of the special Shabbatot, the 4 special Shabbatot before Pesach. What does that mean? If you go to shul on this Shabbos, you're going to see 3 Torahs, right? One, the special reading of, before Pesach, the last of the 4. One, because it's Rosh Chodesh, and one, because it's the regular sequential Torah. Okay. Something else I want to mention about this is that the number of aliyot, that number of people called to the Torah, will also follow this pattern. Now on Shabbat, you have 7, it's the 7th day, but Rosh Chodesh, an ordinary weekday, you'll have 3. Rosh Chodesh, more important, you'll have 4. Holidays, more important, you'll have 5. Yom Kippur, more important, you'll have 6, right? So in some ways, it's also reflecting the calendar. Okay, so we have an offering for Rosh Chodesh, and we're told what it is. I'm not going to go through the details, except that there is this odd statement in verse 15, right? 1 goat, in addition to everything that came before, l'chatat lifnei Adonai, as a purification offering before God. The rabbis, this is very strange. We don't see chatat l'Adonai elsewhere in these various things that are listed, the days that are listed. So the rabbis say it's not really before God, it's for God. That is on God's behalf. This is obviously a midrash. It's not what the Torah is saying, but they say this is God's offering because God did something that required this purification. So what did God do with respect to Rosh Chodesh, where God needs to bring this kind of sin offering or something to make up for something that God did that wasn't, I wouldn't say it's wrong, but it was harmful in some way. So we have this wonderful midrash about the moon. And it's really based around, because Rosh Chodesh, right, is the new moon. So it's based around creation and the story of creation. And if you remember, the world is created in 7 days. And what do we have on the first day? We have light, right? God created, spoke, let there be light, there's light, right? We get to the 4th day and we have the sun, the moon, and the stars, right? So that's also light, right? So what about the light from the first day? Well, that light was set aside for the righteous. I've mentioned this before. Moses will be able to use that light to see the whole promised land before he dies. But there's something else about the 4th day, and that is that it says God created the 2 big lights, the 2 great lights, and then it says the great light, which will shine during the day, and the lesser light, which will shine at night. So here, God created the 2 big lights, and then it's the big light for the day and the little light for the night. So how do we resolve that contradiction? So the rabbis, the Midrash says this: God originally created the moon the size of the sun, and then God said a king cannot have 2 crowns, right? Right? And therefore, we're going to make the moon smaller. Right? And so the rabbis say, well, this offering, this purification offering, is because of what God did to the moon. God diminished the moon. I think it's very fanciful and clever. Well, for whatever reason, on Rosh Chodesh, right, we do have this korban chatat, this purification offering. Okay, and now we move to the holidays, beginning with biblically the first holiday of the year. And of course, we are only a couple of weeks away now from Pesach, which if you have as much to do in your house as I have to do in mine, it's not a comforting thought. At any rate, in the first month, remember Passover is the first month of the year by the Bible, on the 14th day of the month and the 15th day of that month, right? 2 days, you have a festival, unleavened bread, and you have the Passover offering, right? So remember that the offerings are cumulative, right? So what does this mean? On Passover, you're going to have actually 3 offerings. The first offering is the daily offering. The second sacrifice is going to be a sacrifice because it's a holiday. And the third one will be the Paschal Lamb, the Passover sacrifice. There's a special sacrifice just for all the holidays, and then there's that sacrifice. And this actually explains why it is that you have an egg on the Seder plate. Right? So if you were wondering why have an egg on the Seder plate, the shank bone on the Seder plate is meant to represent the Korban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, that offering which was slaughtered by the people. Remember, the blood was put on the doorposts before they left, right? But there was also a holiday offering. So the egg represents the holiday offering because there were 2 offerings on Passover, not just 1. By the way, since Sandy asked about meat earlier, if you're a vegetarian, what do you do about the shank bone? And the answer is there are a number of things you can do. One of them is to use a beet, boiled beet, which at my Seder table, because my wife is a vegetarian, that's what we have on the Seder plate, not a shank bone, but beet. Okay, so we've done the Passover offering, and now we're moving on to Shavuot, right? The feast of the first fruits. And now, I'm sorry, Sukkot, right? And we have the offerings for Sukkot. And we're moving through the year. And then we come to Shavuot. First, we're going to come to Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, which is, what does it tell us? How do we observe it? As on that day, you do no work, and it is a day of horn blowing, right? True horn blowing. So what's Rosh Hashanah about? According to this list of holidays and sacrifices, it's not about the new year, because remember, the new year was back on Passover. The rabbis say it's one of 4 New Years, then it becomes later. It's a day of blowing the shofar. That's really what it's about. And we have various offerings. And then on the 10th day of the same month, right, that 7th month, we have a sacred day, and it says, "Ve'initem ef nashotechem," you have to afflict your soul, right? Doesn't exactly explain why. What does it mean to afflict your soul in our tradition? Principally, it means fasting. This is the origin of the idea that you fast on Yom Kippur. This passage is read on Yom Kippur as the Musaf, as the Maftir reading on Yom Kippur. And all of these passages become the Maftir, that is with the thing that's read from the second Torah on holidays. And now we get to Sukkot, and Sukkot is interesting because what's specified here, unlike Passover, what's specified here is a different sacrifice for every day of the 7 days of Sukkot, right? And actually, if you look at the numbers, they increase. So let's just look quickly. 7 days, and you present these various offerings. And then on the second day, 12 bulls. What was there on the first day? We had 13 bulls and 2 rams. On the second day, it's 12 bulls. On the 13th day, it's 11 bulls. So it's working downward. I'm sorry, I said upward. It's working downward. Each day, different sacrifices. And when you get to the last day, to the 7th day of Pesach, you will find that you have actually, the 7th day of Sukkot, I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking. You will find that you've actually offered a total of 70 bulls over the course of this period. Now, the rabbis think, of course, in our day, it's very different, but according to their worldview, there are 70 nations in the world, right? 70 peoples, 70 countries. And so they say over the course of Sukkot, 1 bull is offered on behalf of every nation in the world. This is a kind of universalist vision. It's as though we are praying for all the other people in the world. We're offering something on their behalf. And then we come to the last day, which is called Shmini, which is the 8th day. And I want to look at that for a minute. Actually, the language of it, which is verse 35. Yom Hashmini Atzeret Tiyeh Lahem. On the 8th day, you should have Atzeret, which is described here as a solemn gathering. Atzeret also means finishing or stopping. Right? If you're on a bus in Israel and you want the bus to stop, you pull the cord or push the button, I think these days, and a sign lights up that says Atzur, stop, right? So this is the stopping festival. It's the end of the holiday season, which began with Rosh Hashanah. And we call it Shmini Atzeret. But it's not really what it says. It's the 8th day, Atzeret, Yom HaShmini Atzeret. On the 8th day, you should have Atzeret. So, at any rate, on Shmini Atzeret, there's only 1 bull, right? Up to that point on the festival of Sukkot, we had 70. Now we only have 1. And the rabbis used this fact to create a kind of another, what I think is a lovely midrash. And what they say is this: God, as it were, invited all the nations to be with God during the holiday of Sukkot. And we see this actually later in prophetic literature, where it says on the holiday of Sukkot, everybody's going to come worship God at Jerusalem. But then God says to the Jewish people, stick around another day. I want you to be just you, to be here with me, right? It's kind of the after party, right? Everybody was invited, but now the after party, just us, right? Because we have a kind of special relationship with God. So it's universal, but it's also particular. So, and this wraps up here, and we have therefore the end of it, and God spoke to Moses just as the people, as he had. So therefore God has now delivered through Moses to the people a description of the sacrifices that they will offer both daily, weekly, monthly, and on all the festivals once they are into the promised land. Okay, so at this point, before we completely wrap up, we have a few minutes. Any questions on anything today? Go ahead, Sandy, and then Saul.
Rabbi, I seem to remember that based on the number of sacrifices going down each day on Sukkot, that's how Shammai decided to decrease when
Yes.
you light the candles on Hanukkah? Is that
Right, that's exactly right. Shammai gives an explanation. Shammai's view is, you have your menorah on the first night, 8 candles on the second night, 7, and so on. Hillel said, no. First night 1, then 2, then 3, as we do. We follow Hillel. What was Shammai's reasoning? Hanukkah is like Sukkot. You had more sacrifices on the first day and working down. Hillel says, yeah, but we have a principle. Malin b'kodesh ve'ein moridin. We always, in matters of holiness, we should never be diminishing. We should always be increasing. Shammai, it's not surprising that Shammai connects Hanukkah to Sukkot, because Sukkot was the first holiday to be celebrated, was the last holiday to be celebrated before Hanukkah. Celebrated in the temple before the Maccabees now come and re-cleanse the temple. And you could say that Hanukkah is kind of it was a kind of makeup for Sukkot, which was missed. Okay, Saul, you had something?
Two things. I know that in the Orthodox Urim, you have something called Yom Kippur Katan, which comes the day before Rosh Chodesh. Very interesting. We don't observe it, but they do.
Right. So, yeah, there is this idea that in preparation, there's a sort of sad day in preparation for happy days. We see this with Esther, right? The fast of Esther followed by Esther and Purim itself. So there's that kind of pattern. We do have Yom Kippur Katan, worth noting. Okay, I'll leave it there. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead.
What is the significance of the women gathering to read Tehillim on Rosh Chodesh?
So Rosh Chodesh does get associated with women. It becomes kind of a women's holiday, right? We have in the Talmud the idea that women are given a day off on Rosh Chodesh, right? They don't have to work, right? I don't think if you're in the working, it isn't an obligatory festival, right? You can't go to your employer and say, I'm sorry, it's Yom Tov tomorrow. There are enough Jewish holidays we try to get off, right? But at any rate, so one explanation which is given is the association women with the moon, because women have a monthly cycle. But the other association, which I think is quite nice, women refuse to contribute to the building of the golden calf, right? It's the men who did, and the women did not, and therefore as a kind of reward to the women, Rosh Chodesh becomes their holiday. And as you know, there are Rosh Chodesh women's groups that meet on Rosh Chodesh, and it's really, in the modern times, it's really become quite a thing. The other thing I'll say about Rosh Chodesh is it's clear it was a much bigger deal than it is in modern times. Rosh Chodesh was really a festival of sorts. It wasn't a full festival where you take off the day. We have references to it in the prophets. There's a Haftarah, actually, which we read on, let me see if I can find it just for half a second. I think it is the Rosh Chodesh Torah. Yeah, so, right. The Rosh Chodesh Torah comes from Isaiah, and it's Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh. Yes, and here we have it at the very end. This is talking about how all the nations eventually will come to Jerusalem, right? And when the time has come to gather the nations in tongues, they will come and behold my glory. I will set a sign among them. and they will declare my glory among the nations, and out of the nations they shall bring your brothers on horses, chariots, drays, mules to Jerusalem, my holy mountain, right? So the whole people of Israel is coming and being gathered in Jerusalem, just as the Israelites bring an offering. And then what will happen in this kind of messianic time, it will be, and on Rosh Chodesh, after Rosh Chodesh, and on Shabbat, after Shabbat, everyone will come and worship me, right? So there's a sense here that Rosh Chodesh is a big deal, right? It's mentioned in this context. And it really does seem that there's a special sacrifice, and it's a very festive, important day. Now, for us, Rosh Chodesh really is, we have some extra prayers. Women do something special, but it is not the quasi festival that it was in certainly in biblical times. Okay, I think we'll leave it there. I want to remind you that next week we're going to leave the book of Numbers for a week. I'm going to talk about Pesach because it is coming, and I'll have something to say about the Seder and the Haggadah. So join me if you can for that, and then we'll resume, not during Pesach, we'll take the week off, and then we'll pick up after Pesach is over, and I hope to see you then. And in the meantime, have a great week.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. You just-